good to be here with everybody. And Chris, Kimberly, thanks for putting this on. So my name's Nate Whigham. I moved to Puerto Rico a little over 2 years ago. I was in Southern California for about 15 years prior to that. And like most people in the mainland, I really didn't know a whole lot about Puerto Rico before I got here, but quickly learned quite a bit and became very, very bullish on the island and across many fronts. My primary business is capital advisory and commercial real estate. So doing debt and equity placement for all property types, all parts of the capital stack, all over the country. And originally came here and intended most to be operating from here, doing deals in the mainland. I'm going to explain a little while later. But because I've become so bullish in Puerto Rico and we're seeing so much opportunity here, we're looking at a bunch of deals in the island as well. So I have a presentation I'm going to go through that I call Why Puerto Rico, and it's really, kind of a Puerto Rico 101. Some of the stuff in it Michael already covered, but really it's a kind of all-encompassing why I'm so bullish on the island. And my intention after the presentation is complete is that you guys will basically be Puerto Rican experts and share my enthusiasm for everything that's going on here on the island. All right, can you guys see my screen here?
Gotcha, we're good.
Okay. All right, so first thing, not investment advice, all the usual stuff, not a lawyer, an investment advisor. This presentation was developed between myself and another gentleman named Matt Greenfader, who owns a company called AG&T, which does real estate investment sales brokerage and other development advisory work in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. And so Puerto Rico, again, very quickly, what is it? It's an island. It's about 1,000 miles southeast of Florida. It's a 2.5-hour flight from Miami. It's about 100 miles by 35 miles. Population is 3.2 million. It's a relatively small island. I think it's roughly the landmass of Connecticut, but has an amazing amount of biodiversity because there's a mountain range that goes parallel east to west through the center of the island. And that really creates these different ecosystems. So you've got the northwest corner, that's a rainforest. El Yunque is a national park. It's the only tropical rainforest in the US. It's beautiful. If you ever come here, definitely recommend, hiking that. But the southwest corner of the island is more arid. It's almost like a desert. In fact, there's a dry forest there. And interestingly, Puerto Rico has 3 of the 5 world's freshwater bioluminescent bays. They're all pretty fantastic, but if you ever get the opportunity to go to the Bay in Vieques, I mean, it is a magical experience. I mean, it's almost like a Disney movie. It's crazy. All right, I think I got a message here. Are you guys not able to see the slides?
No, Nate, I'm only seeing the Why Puerto Rico slide.
Okay, let me see if I can do something else here. Is it moving now?
Yep, now we see it.
Okay, all right, so start back here.
Here it is.
Not going to repeat them. We'll just get caught up on the slides here. Okay, so when I talk to people in the mainland about Puerto Rico, there's a whole bunch of really common misperceptions that I just hear all the time. One is, there's no power on the island. It was totally destroyed by the hurricane 4 years ago. It's like kind of America, maybe not. They don't speak English. And actually, interestingly, before Hurricane Maria, only 41% of Americans knew that Puerto Rico was U.S. territory. The number is over 80 now because of that news coverage. But we wanted to dispel some of those common misconceptions. Puerto Rico is 100% America. It's an American territory. All Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. You have federal courts on the island, the FBI, the IRS, they're all here. It's all the same property and title rights as the mainland. It's the dollar, and all Puerto Ricans, have the ability to get a U.S. passport, and the military is here. So when I talk about Puerto Rico, I think it's really important to put it in context with the rest of the country. If Puerto Rico was a state, It would be the 31st largest by population. So 19 states have fewer American citizens than this island. You can see the list there. And it would be the 37th largest by size of the economy. So that means there are 13 states that have less productive power than this island. And, again, when I put Puerto Rico in context, I always like to pick on Hawaii for obvious reasons. It's the only state that's an island. And when you do a quick comparison, you can see that Puerto Rico has more than twice the population, a larger economy, or I'd say a significantly larger economy. It's less than half the distance from the mainland. We're 2.5 hours from Miami. The closest flight Hawaii is from anywhere on the mainland. It's about 5.5 hours to San Francisco. But more importantly, they have fundamentally very different economies. Hawaii's biggest industry is tourism, whereas Puerto Rico, our biggest industry, as Michael mentioned, is high-tech manufacturing. It's half of our economy. Tourism actually only represents about 6.7% of economic activity. We're going to get into a little bit why that is just in a little bit here. But one really interesting fact that I think that most people, even in Puerto Rico, aren't really aware of is Puerto Ricans on average are actually wealthier than Hawaiians. And the reason why I say that is Hawaiian per capita income is about 58,000, Puerto Rico is about 31, but Hawaii has the highest cost of living in the entire country. It's 98% higher than the US average. Puerto Rico's cost of living is 27% lower than the US average. So when you adjust per capita income relative to purchasing power, Puerto Ricans are actually 47% on average wealthier than Hawaiians. And then if you look at, again, like I said, tourism's Hawaii's biggest industry. They have 57,000 hotel rooms on that, on the Hawaiian Islands, whereas here we only have about 14,000. So let's kind of go over a real brief history of Puerto Rico. Columbus discovers Puerto Rico in 1498, claims it for Spain. Spain controlled the island until 1898, so basically exactly 400 years. They really ran it as like an agriculturally focused colony, and U.S. got it from Spain in the Spanish-American War in 1898. The U.S. didn't do a whole lot with the island until 1950s, with the exception of passing the Jones Act in 1920, which did two things: it granted Puerto Rico citizenship, but also allowed the U.S. military to conscript them. So you can see the picture here. That was a picture of a Puerto Rican regiment of soldiers in World War II. So mentioned in 1950, U.S. Congress allows Puerto Rico to basically elect their own governor and begin autonomous governance. That first governor was a gentleman named Luis Munoz Marin. He's the guy that the airport is named after. And he worked very closely with the Kennedy administration to very actively industrialize the island. And they did this through a program called Operation Bootstrap. And the intention was really to shift the economy's basis from basically sugarcane production to industrial production. Interestingly, at the same time, the mafia controlled Cuba and started trying to make investments in Puerto Rico. And both Munoz Marin and the Kennedys said, hey, we don't want PR to be this mob paradise like Cuba. So they very actively worked to disincentivize tourism development on the island, which is one of the reasons why even still today, the tourism industry is so underdeveloped relative to demand, which also creates a pretty big opportunity we'll get to. Now, the economy here was doing very well through Operation Bootstrap, but then in 1976, the IRS passed Section 936, which granted U.S. companies an income tax exemption on port-generated income. So that really threw a bunch of gasoline on an already very strong economy, and the economy just boomed like crazy. And that's really when Big Pharma and a lot of these other manufacturers came to Puerto Rico, take advantage of this tax incentive. And at that time, Puerto Rico was the top pharma producer in the entire planet. Today it's number 5, still quite significant. As Michael mentioned, it's number 1 by far in the US. But for about 25 years, from the 70s to early 2000s, it was number 1. So everything was great. I'm sure you've heard on the news, people talk about some challenges with the Puerto Rican economy over the last decade or so. So the real question is what happened? How did it go from being this, kind of hyperactive, really strong economy to being in distress? Basically what happened is in 1996, Clinton was lobbied by the Puerto Rican government to actually phase out that tax incentive. And from what I understand, the logic was if we have a tax structure in the island that more mirrors a typical state, then our probability of becoming a state goes up, and the pro-statehood party basically lobbied the president to eliminate this incentive, said sure. And this phase out began from 96 over a 10-year period. So as this happened, as you'd expect, companies that were here because of the tax incentives started leaving. Around 2000 or so, the economy started really shifting down. The 9/11 happened, and it really kind of went to started into 6 when the incentive was fully phased out, full-blown recession. A lot of companies had moved, and this is also when NAFTA was rising. So companies are going to Mexico. You got companies going to Ireland, and because of this, employment migrated heavily from the private to the public sector. Today, it's still around 25% of total employment. And the government at the time basically started borrowing a lot of money to fund all this cost of additional employment and other things, while having a reduced tax basis. And that's obviously an unsustainable position. And it all kind of came to a head in the early 2010s with the Puerto Rican bond crisis. Now, one thing that's, especially from an investment perspective, that's really critical to understand about that is how the island's coming out of it. So in 2016, the U.S. Congress passed a law called the Puerto Rican Oversight Management and Economic Stability Act, or PROMESA, established the Fiscal Oversight Board. I believe it's a 6-member board. They're all presidential appointees. And PROMESA basically has final say over Puerto Rico's budget and spending. The Puerto Rican government submits a budget, PROMESA marks it up, sends it back, and that's basically how the island has to move forward. And so PROMESA does not go away until Puerto Rico, I believe, has 4 consecutive years of a budget surplus and access to short and long-term credit markets at reasonable rates. And so what that means is going to be in place until all the bonds are restructured. In 2017, PROMESA took Puerto Rico to a bankruptcy equivalent process to do that, and which I believe has been relatively successful. I think something like 40% or close to half of those bonds have now been restructured. So they're really kind of working. They were the entity controlling the workout of the island around this economic stress, and it was working. 2019 was the first time in 12 years that Puerto Rico experienced both positive population growth and positive economic growth. And again, as an investor looking at the island, I think that's really fundamental to understand, because it really means that the island cannot get itself into another bond crisis because the federal government won't allow it. So when I talk to, I've been working on bringing capital to this island for over 2 years now. When I talk to potential investors, they always ask about the economy, which we just discussed. The other thing that always comes up is Hurricane Maria. People will ask me questions. It's been almost 4 years, and I'll still have people say, well, does the island have power again yet? So let's kind of briefly talk about that. So Hurricane Maria was a Category 5 hurricane, strongest hurricane to hit the island in 100 years. It's kind of a worst case scenario. The eye of the hurricane went from the southeast corner across the entire center of the island to the northwest corner, did $100 billion in damage, 100% power loss across the island, and destroyed almost 200,000 homes. So it's a pretty serious event, certainly. It was really something really important to understand about the destruction that it caused. So in Puerto Rico, 55% of the housing stock here is what here is called informally constructed. And it's what on the mainland we would call illegal and permanent. And there's a reason for that. It's kind of a nice story, but it creates problems. And that's that, if you live in one of the smaller towns in the center of the island and you want to build a house, the family might have a lot of land. You go buy all the construction materials and beer and pizza, all the other guys in the village come and help you. You build it together over a week or so. And they all do that because when it's their turn to have a house, you're going to come help them, which creates a great sense of community, but at the same time creates problems because these homes are not being built up to code. And so when a Category 5 hurricane crosses the island, those are the ones that unfortunately really suffer. And in fact, 98% of formally constructed assets on the island, things that are built to code suffered virtually no damage from the hurricane. So Puerto Rican building codes are actually very, very robust. So they're designed for both hurricane events and seismic events. And when things are on the island are properly constructed, the hurricane risk is really quite minimal. So in talking about power, I won't go into too much detail. Mike will address several of these things, but I think the most important thing that's going on right now, which I think is tremendously positive, is the fact that LUMA, which is a private company, now directly controls the management of the transmission of the power around the island. And I can tell you, since they took control, I think it was June 1st, I've already personally seen a kind of dramatic difference in, for power, it comes back now in a couple hours instead of a few days, which is what it was for, the first year and a half of your year. So the other thing is, $13 billion of federal money was allocated in September of last year, specifically to rebuild power infrastructure and to rehab schools. So there's a lot of money right now available to create a much more robust power infrastructure, all of which is happening. And then speaking of federal money, after Hurricane Maria, Congress allocated a total about $65 billion of aid to the island, most of which was not released by the previous administration for whatever reason. But when Biden came in, he basically opened the tap. So all that money is flowing in, and call the island's economy is about $105 billion. This is about $65 billion of federal aid. So the impact is going to be dramatic, and we're already seeing a tremendous amount of projects getting approved, things happening. And keep in mind, this is coming almost 4 years after the hurricane occurred. So most of the more developed parts of the island had already recovered themselves. So really, this is capital just coming in really on top of that to improve infrastructure and do additional things. One of the most relevant, probably to this group, is there was about $20 billion of community development block grants allocated to the island that are being administered through HUD, specifically for a variety of purposes, but a big chunk of that is specifically for to develop affordable housing to provide homes for people that were displaced by the natural disasters. And even to date, I think just around $11 billion or so of that is still not yet allocated. So there's a lot of money coming in for a lot of different projects, which is going to promote a lot of activity. And also, if you're a developer, you're looking to do, say, a low-income housing project, there's probably ways or certain processes for you to access that capital. So, as Michael mentioned, the economy, to me, I think the fundamental structure of the economy is quite strong and very interesting from an investment perspective. It's again, half the economy is advanced manufacturing, half of that is pharmaceutical and biomedical manufacturing. And Puerto Rico, again, makes more than twice of that stuff than the next 2 states combined. So this is just a similar map showing the presence around the island. That industry is really ubiquitous. And as a result of that, we have this really phenomenal STEM labor force that was developed to really support that industry. And as again, Michael mentioned, NASA hires more engineers from the University of Puerto Rico Mayagüez than any other school in the country. And then you combine that with the fact that we have a cost of living 27% lower than the average in the US. You can basically hire very, very high quality engineers, STEM talent at a much lower cost than probably anywhere else in the country. And it's the 6th largest concentration of scientists and engineers in the entire world. So, and by the way, this presentation is 50 pages. I'm not going to go through everything in the interest of time, but it will be available to anyone, after the conference that would like to review in more detail. There's a few more things I just want to touch on, again, just to describe why I'm so bullish here on the island. And first one is the tax structure. This is really what brought me here initially. If you look at most countries in the world, they tax their citizens based on residence. You live in our country, you use our resources, you use our infrastructure, you're going to pay taxes, which to me makes sense. There's only 2 countries in the world that tax based on citizenship, regardless of where you live. First one is Eritrea, a small country in Africa. They charge their citizens a 2% flat tax if they live outside of the country. And then you have the United States, and Uncle Sam doesn't care where you live, he wants your money. There's really kind of one exception to that, and Puerto Rico because we have no federal representation in Congress. There's one non-voting Puerto Rican rep. And because of the Constitution, you can't have taxation without representation. If you are a Puerto Rican resident, you do not pay federal taxes on your Puerto Rican sourced income. And the island has its own internal tax structure, but in 2012, they passed a whole bunch of tax incentives. And I'm only going to briefly go over them. Other people later, I think, are going to talk about in more detail. But the one that was really relevant to me that brought me here was Act 2022, now under Act 60. And basically it says that if you move your business here and your business does what they call exporting services, which really just means you do business with people that are not in Puerto Rico, that business is the maximum corporate tax percent under Act 20. And then under Act 22, you have an interest tax, a tax exemption on dividends, distributions, and capital gains to you personally. So if you're like me, where you're an advisor, or any kind of intermediary or consultant, or you are an asset manager, you run a trading firm, something like that, it's a phenomenal incentive because effectively your net tax exposure, if you set everything up properly, is 4%, which for U.S. citizens, you can't get anything close to that anywhere else in the world. So, but Puerto Rico is really is the lowest effective tax rate for U.S. citizens globally. And then in addition to that, 98% of the island is an opportunity zone. So phenomenal tax incentives here. Whole bunch of other ones for a variety of industries. I'm not going to get into here, but with the exception of one that's really interesting and relevant to real estate, but lots of different things you can come to the island and do and set up shop and get very, very advantageous tax structures. So I want to talk a little bit more specifically about hospitality. And as I mentioned earlier, going back to the 50s and the Kennedy administration, for a very long time, the island was really actively disincentivizing tourism development. And for a very long time, they didn't need it. They had a phenomenal manufacturing economy. There was no incentive to develop tourism. And so it never really was promoted until the, again, 2010s, when the island's in a lot of economic stress. I think the government looked around and said, hey, we're in the middle of the Caribbean. We have a beautiful Caribbean island. We really should be promoting tourism. And obviously it helps promote economic development. And so the government passed Act 74, which created a tax credit specifically for tourism related development. And basically the way that tax credit works is if you do any kind of tourism related project, you're going to get a tax credit from the government for its two flavors. One's 30 or 40%. Difference is the timing of how they're released. Most people do the 30, but that's 30% of your entire developed project cost basis, including your acquisition basis. It's factored in that number. And if you do the 30% program, you get a third of the credit, which is roughly 10% of your project cost, when you get your construction permits. And you can monetize these tax credits really, really efficiently. It's a very robust market in Puerto Rico for them. And they generally sell for around 90 to 92 cents on the dollar. So you're a real estate investor. You think about the impact that has on your returns. And these numbers here are just a very high level, showing what the difference in the returns on a deal will be. But you can see that if you're doing a standard hospitality related development, your leveraged return given the tax credit goes up by 70%. And that's not even factoring the fact that 98% of the island is an opportunity zone. And so when you really look at the fundamentally underdeveloped hospitality market, and I'm going to go back here to this slide. Puerto Rico's hospitality market today is recovering twice as fast as the mainland coming out of COVID. It's a domestic flight, all your travel stuff around vaccines and a test is really straightforward. And so, and everyone that's on the Zoom that lives in Puerto Rico can certainly attest to the fact that, we have just seen phenomenal amount of tourists on the island probably since March. I think 4th of July, we were at 95% occupancy, which is really unheard of. So you have in a fundamentally underdeveloped hospitality market that I think alone justifies, a lot of additional development, but you get your tourism tax credit on top of that, and it's an option. I mean, you can't replicate that in anywhere in the country. I mean, I'm seeing deals where the unlevered yield on cost, which if you're a hotel investor, you'll understand what that is north of 20% before incentives. So I think this Puerto Rico right now is the best opportunity to invest in hospitality, probably globally. So kind of wrap it all up. You've got the fact that this is 100% U.S. territory. It's got phenomenal tax incentives. The island's economy is recovering very strongly. All the federal money from Maria is finally coming in now. After the island for the most part has recovered. You got supply chains getting reshored to the island. You got this really awesome fundamental underlying economic structure where half of your activity is very, very advanced manufacturing. And then you've got these really great hospitality opportunities. And there's a whole bunch of other opportunities around high-end housing and affordable housing as well that we're looking at that I haven't even had time to get into. But I'm super bullish on Puerto Rico across almost every major commercial real estate asset class. So that's what I got, guys. If you have any questions, probably got a few minutes here.